My mother slammed the front door so hard that the family portrait fell off the wall. "Sofia Martinez, if you marry that man, you're no longer our daughter." Those words echoed through our house in Riverside, California, as my father stood behind her, arms crossed, nodding in agreement. What they didn't know was that the man they despised so much was about to become one of the most powerful people in America. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. It all started 6 months earlier at a coffee shop in downtown Sacramento. I was running late for my shift at the nonprofit where I worked as a communications coordinator, juggling my laptop bag and a stack of grant proposals when I collided with someone carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. The collision sent papers flying everywhere and left both of us soaked in caffeine. "I am so sorry," the man said, immediately kneeling to help gather my scattered documents. He had kind brown eyes and spoke with a calm authority that somehow made the chaos feel manageable. "Please, let me buy you a new coffee and pay for any dry cleaning." That's how I met Daniel Thompson. He was wearing a simple navy suit, nothing flashy, and drove a modest Honda Accord. When he handed me his business card, it simply read, "Daniel Thompson, Consultant." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push. There was something refreshingly humble about him in a city full of people trying to impress everyone with their titles and connections. Our first coffee turned into dinner, then weekend walks along the American River, then quiet evenings cooking together in my small apartment. Daniel was different from anyone I'd dated before. He listened more than he talked, asked thoughtful questions about my work helping veterans access healthcare benefits, and never once bragged about his job or income. When I mentioned my student loans, he simply nodded understandingly. When my car broke down, he spent his Saturday under the hood fixing it himself. The only unusual thing about Daniel was his phone. It rang constantly, at all hours, and he always stepped away to take the calls. "Work emergency," he'd explain apologetically, and I respected his privacy. We all have demanding jobs, I figured. What I found endearing was how he always came back. More focused on me, as if those interruptions made him appreciate our time together even more. 3 months into our relationship, I brought Daniel home to meet my parents. The drive to their house in Riverside felt different that day. Daniel seemed more tense than usual, checking his phone frequently and asking oddly specific questions about my family's political views and my father's work as a retired police sergeant. My parents, Roberto and Carmen Martinez, had very clear expectations for their daughter's future husband. He needed to be successful, preferably in a traditional career like law or medicine, from a good family with established roots in the community, and Catholic. Daniel checked exactly none of these boxes, at least not obviously, when we arrived. At their house, my mother answered the door with her practiced smile that I knew meant she was already forming judgments. My father emerged from his recliner, still wearing his weekend uniform of golf polo and khakis, extending a firm handshake. That I recognized as his way of sizing up a man's character. "So, Daniel," my father began over dinner, cutting into the carne asada my mother had prepared, "Sofia tells us you're a consultant." "What kind of consulting?" "Government relations," Daniel replied simply, taking a bite of rice. "I help organizations navigate federal regulations and policy changes." My mother's eyebrows raised slightly. "Government work doesn't usually pay very well. How do you plan to provide for a family?" I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment, but Daniel remained calm. "I'm fortunate to do work I find meaningful, Mrs. Martinez. Financial stability is important, but I believe there are many ways to measure success." That answer did not land well. My father leaned back in his chair, a gesture I recognized as the beginning of an interrogation. "What's your background, son? Where did you go to school? What does your family do?" "I went to West Point, then served in the Army for several years before transitioning to civilian government work. My family has a tradition of public service." "West Point?" My mother's tone shifted slightly, showing the first hint of approval. Military service meant something to her generation. "What rank did you achieve?" "I was a captain when I left active duty, ma'am." The conversation continued like this throughout dinner, my parents probing for details about Daniel's career, his family's financial situation, his long-term plans. Daniel answered everything politely but vaguely, never offering more information than directly asked. I could see my parents growing frustrated with his evasiveness, interpreting his privacy as secretiveness or, worse, as having something to hide. After Daniel left that evening, my parents didn't waste time sharing their opinions. "He's hiding something, Mija," my mother said, washing dishes with more force than necessary. "A man his age who's so vague about his work? Either he's unemployed or he's involved in something shady." My father nodded grimly. "And did you notice his car? That Honda has to be 10 years old." If he's making good money as a consultant, why is he driving around in that old thing? Maybe he's practical with money, I suggested weakly. Practical? My mother turned from the sink, dish towel in hand. Sophia, you're 28 years old. You need to think about your future. This man can't even afford to take you to a nice restaurant. How is he going to buy a house? Pay for children's education? You deserve better than someone who's just getting by. Their disapproval only intensified over the following weeks. Every phone call home included pointed questions about Daniel's real job, suggestions that I was settling for less than I deserved, and increasingly obvious hints about suitable alternatives. My cousin's friend who was a successful orthodontist. The son of my mother's coworker who had just made partner at his law firm. The neighbor's nephew who owned 3 auto shops across the Inland Empire. The breaking point came when Daniel proposed. It happened on a quiet Thursday evening in my apartment. We'd just finished dinner and were washing dishes together when he suddenly got down on one knee in my tiny kitchen, holding a simple but beautiful ring. Sophia, he said, his voice steady despite the nervousness in his eyes, I know I can't offer you the conventional life that most people might expect. My work is demanding and sometimes complicated. But I love you completely, and I want to build a life with you. Will you marry me? I said yes without hesitation, but I knew the real challenge would be telling my parents. When I called them the next morning with the news, the silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Mija, my mother, finally said, her voice carefully controlled, you need to come home this weekend. We need to talk. That Saturday, I drove to Riverside alone. Daniel had offered to come with me, but I thought it might be easier to handle my parents' concerns without him there to bear the brunt of their disapproval. I was wrong. Absolutely not, my father declared the moment I showed them the ring. Sophia, you're making the biggest mistake of your life. You don't even know him, I protested. You met him once for 3 hours. We know enough, my mother interjected. He's secretive about his work, he drives an old car, he lives modestly, and now he's trying to lock you down with a ring before you realize you can do better. What if I love him? Love doesn't pay bills, my father said bluntly. Love doesn't buy houses or send kids to college. You think you love him now, but wait until you're struggling to make ends meet while your friends are taking vacations and buying nice things. Wait until you're embarrassed to invite people over because you can't afford a decent home. The conversation escalated from there, voices rising, old family dynamics surfacing. My parents reminded me of every opportunity they'd sacrificed to give me a good education, every expectation they'd held for my future. They painted vivid pictures of financial struggle and social embarrassment, warning me that I was throwing away my potential for a man who couldn't provide the life I deserved. When I finally left their house that evening, my mother's ultimatum rang in my ears, choose carefully, Sophia. Some decisions can't be undone. I drove back to Sacramento in tears, questioning everything. Was I being naive? Was Daniel really the right choice, or was I letting emotions cloud my judgment about practical realities? But when I walked into my apartment and saw Daniel waiting for me with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and a concerned expression, I knew my answer. This man, who remembered my favorite dishes and worried about my emotional well-being, who fixed my car and listened to my work frustrations and made me laugh during stressful days, this was the person I wanted to build a life with, regardless of what anyone else thought. What I didn't know was that in just a few weeks, everything my parents thought they knew about Daniel Thompson was about to change completely. The wedding planning began immediately, despite my parents' ongoing disapproval. Daniel and I decided on a small ceremony in 6 months, figuring that would give my family time to come around while keeping things simple and affordable. Daniel insisted on paying for everything himself, which only reinforced my parents' suspicions about his financial limitations. A backyard wedding, my mother said when I told her our plans over the phone. Sophia, even your cousin Maria had her reception at the Riverside Convention Center. We want something intimate, Mom. Just close family and friends. You mean cheap, she replied curtly. This is exactly what your father and I were worried about. Meanwhile, Daniel's behavior became increasingly strange. He would disappear for entire weekends with vague explanations about work commitments in Washington. His phone calls became even more frequent and urgent. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night to find him on the balcony, speaking in hushed tones to someone about briefings and security protocols. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. One evening in late October, Daniel came home looking more exhausted than I'd ever seen him. His usually crisp appearance was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Rough day? I asked, bringing him a beer from the refrigerator. He pulled me down onto the couch beside him, wrapping his arms around me tightly. Sophia, there are some things about my work that I haven't been able to share with you. It's not because I don't trust you, it's because of security requirements and legal obligations. My stomach dropped. Security requirements? Daniel, what exactly do you do? I can't explain everything right now, but I need you to know that everything is about to change. There's going to be a lot of media attention, and people are going to want to know about us, about you. Are you prepared for that? Media attention? I work for a small nonprofit. Why would anyone care about me? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Because in 3 weeks, I'm going to be confirmed as the next Secretary of Defense. I stared at him, certain I had misheard. Secretary of what? Defense. The President-elect nominated me. Last week. The confirmation hearings start Monday. The room began to spin. You're telling me that my fiancé, who I thought was a mid-level government consultant, is about to become the Secretary of Defense? As in, one of the most powerful people in the entire country. I know this is a lot to process. A lot to process? I stood up, pacing across the small living room. Daniel, I've been defending you to my parents for months. They think you're broke and secretive, and I've been telling them that money doesn't matter, that you're a good man with a steady job. Now you're telling me you're about to run the Pentagon. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I couldn't risk any leaks before the official announcement. And honestly, I wasn't sure the nomination would go through. These things can fall apart quickly. In politics. So when you said you were a government consultant, I am a government consultant. I've been serving as a senior advisor on defense policy for the transition team. Before that, I worked at the Department of Defense in various capacities. I just couldn't tell you how senior those positions were. I sank back onto the couch, my head in my hands. My parents are going to lose their minds. What do you mean? They think you're not good enough for me. They think you can't provide for a family. They've been trying to convince me to break up with you for months. Daniel was quiet for a moment. And what do you think? I looked at him, really looked at him. The man sitting beside me was the same person who had spent last weekend helping me paint my apartment, who brought me soup when I was sick, who listened patiently to my work stories and never once made me feel small or unimportant. The fact that he was about to become one of the most powerful people in America didn't change any of that. I think I'm going to marry the man I fell in love with, whether he's a consultant or the Secretary of Defense. The relief in his eyes was unmistakable. There's more you need to know. My security detail starts tomorrow. There will be background checks on you, on your family, on your friends. Our entire relationship is going to be scrutinized by the media and by political opponents looking for ammunition. What kind of scrutiny? They'll look into your job, your finances, your social media posts, your college activities, everything. They'll interview your coworkers, your neighbors, probably your ex-boyfriends. And they'll want to know about your family, your parents' political affiliations, your father's law enforcement record, any potential security risks. The magnitude of what he was telling me began to sink in. And if they find something they don't like? Then I could lose the nomination, or you could become a political liability that I'd be pressured to distance myself from. Are you asking me to step back? Never. But I need you to understand what you're signing up for. This isn't just about marrying me anymore. You're about to become the fiancé of a cabinet member. Your life will never be private again. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about my quiet job at the nonprofit, my small apartment, my simple life. By next week, all of that could be turned upside down. Reporters might be calling my workplace, photographing me walking to my car, digging through my social media posts from college. The next morning, Daniel was gone before I woke up, but he'd left a note on my coffee maker: I love you exactly as you are. Nothing else matters. At work, I found it impossible to concentrate. Every time my phone buzzed, I wondered if it was a reporter or a background investigator. During my lunch break, I called my best friend Jessica to try to process everything. Wait. Back up, Jessica said when I finished explaining. Your mysterious fiancé is about to become the Secretary of Defense? Apparently. Sophia, do you realize what this means? You're going to be married to someone who briefs the president on national security. You'll probably meet world leaders. You'll live in an entirely different world. I know. And I have no idea if I'm ready for any of it. Are you going to tell your parents? I had been dreading that question all morning. I have to. The confirmation hearings start Monday, and his nomination will be all over the news. They're going to feel pretty stupid about all their concerns regarding his financial prospects. That's what I'm worried about. They're going to be humiliated that they spent months telling me I could do better. That evening, I drove to Riverside again. This time, I had called ahead and asked my parents to make sure they were both home because I had important news to share. They assumed I was coming to tell them I had broken up with Daniel. I found them In the living room, my father watching the evening news while my mother worked on a crossword puzzle. They both looked up expectantly when I walked in. Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something about Daniel. Finally coming to your senses? My father asked, muting the television. Not exactly. Do you remember when Daniel told you he works in government relations? We remember him being vague about having a real job, my mother replied. Well, it turns out he wasn't being vague because he doesn't have a real job. He was being vague because his job requires security clearances and confidentiality agreements. They looked at me blankly. Daniel is about to be confirmed as the Secretary of Defense. The crossword puzzle fell from my mother's hands. My father's mouth actually dropped open. The Secretary of Defense, I repeated. As in, the person who runs the military. His confirmation hearings start Monday, and it'll be all over the news. For the first time in my adult life, my parents were completely speechless. The man you've been telling me isn't good enough for me, I continued, is about to become one of the most powerful people in the United States government. My mother finally found her voice. But he drives that old Honda. Apparently. When you're about to be confirmed for a cabinet position, driving a flashy car might send the wrong message to senators who control your nomination. My father was staring at the television screen as if seeing it for the first time. Secretary of Defense, he repeated slowly. Sophia, do you understand what this means? It means you might want to reconsider your opinion of my fiancé. The silence in my parents' living room stretched on for what felt like an eternity. My father slowly reached for the remote and turned the volume back up on the television, as if hoping to hear Daniel's name mentioned in the evening news to confirm that his daughter hadn't lost her mind. My mother stood up abruptly and walked to the kitchen without saying a word. I could hear her opening and closing cabinets, the sound of running water, the clink of dishes, her standard response to overwhelming situations. Sophia, my father finally said, his voice carefully measured, are you absolutely certain about this? His confirmation hearings start Monday, Dad. You can watch them on C-SPAN if you want. He ran his hands through his graying hair, a gesture I remembered from my teenage years when I'd presented him with particularly challenging situations. The Secretary of Defense. Jesus Christ. Roberto, my mother called sharply from the kitchen. Sorry, Carmen. It's just. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, somewhere between awe and terror. Mija, do you realize what this means for our family? Before I could answer, my mother returned carrying a tray with 3 cups of coffee and a plate of her homemade churros, as if caffeine and sugar could somehow make sense of this revelation. I need to understand something, she said, setting the tray down on the coffee table with shaking hands. If Daniel is really going to be the Secretary of Defense, why didn't he tell us? Why did he let us think he was just some low-level government worker? Because he legally couldn't tell you. The nomination process is confidential until it's officially announced. And because he wanted you to judge him for who he is, not for his title or position. Well, that backfired spectacularly, my father muttered. My mother sat down heavily in her favorite armchair. Sophia, I don't understand any of this. How does someone go from being a captain in the army to Secretary of Defense? What has he been doing all these years? I realized I didn't actually know many of the details myself. I think he's had various positions at the Pentagon. He mentioned serving as a senior advisor recently, but he couldn't discuss specifics because of security clearances. Security clearances, my father repeated, shaking his head. Our daughter is marrying someone with security clearances. What does this mean for the wedding? My mother asked suddenly. Will there be security people? Background checks? Will the ceremony be safe? That question hit me like a cold splash of water. I hadn't even thought about the practical implications for our wedding planning. I don't know, Mom. Daniel mentioned that there would be background checks on me and probably on you too, but we haven't talked about wedding security. My father's law enforcement background kicked in immediately. If he's Secretary of Defense, he'll have a full Secret Service detail. That means advanced teams, threat assessments, secured perimeters. Sophia, your backyard wedding just became a federal security operation. The reality of the situation was starting to overwhelm me. Maybe we should postpone the wedding until after he's confirmed and settled into the position. Absolutely not, my mother said firmly, surprising both my father and me. If this man is going to be Secretary of Defense, then he's going to be our son-in-law, and we're going to welcome him into this family properly. I stared at her. But just yesterday you told me I should break up with him. Yesterday I thought he was hiding the fact that he was unemployed or involved in something shady. Today I find out he was hiding the fact that he's about to become one of the most important people in the president's cabinet. She paused, looking embarrassed. Your father and I may have misjudged the situation. May have? I laughed despite myself. My father stood up and began pacing, his mind clearly working through the implications. We need to think about this practically. If Daniel is confirmed, you'll be living in Washington. You'll probably have to quit your job, move across the country, leave your entire life here. I hadn't thought about that either. And what about children? How do you raise kids when one parent has that level of responsibility and security requirements? Dad, we're not even married yet. But these are things you need to discuss before the wedding, Mija. This isn't just about love anymore. This is about whether you're prepared for a completely different kind of life. My mother reached over and took my hand. Sophia, are you sure you're ready for this? The scrutiny, the pressure, the constant public attention. I don't know, I admitted. But I know I love Daniel, and I know he's a good man. Everything else, we'll figure out together. My phone buzzed with a text message from Daniel. Confirmation hearings moved up to tomorrow morning. Can you come to DC tonight? I want you there. I showed the message to my parents. Tomorrow, my mother exclaimed. But that's Sunday. Don't they usually do these things during the week? Apparently not when it's the Secretary of Defense, I replied, already mentally calculating flight times. My father was quiet for a moment, then said, Carmen, pack a bag. We're going with her. What? If our future son-in-law is testifying before the Senate to become Secretary of Defense, we should be there to support him. And to support our daughter. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. You want to come to Washington? With me? Sophia, my mother said gently, we may not have understood the situation before, but we understand it now. This man chose you, out of everyone he could have chosen, and he's been willing to risk his career and his nomination by staying with you despite the political complications that could arise. That tells us something important about his character. Plus, my father added with a slight smile, we probably owe him an apology for assuming he wasn't good enough for our daughter. 2 hours later, we were on a flight to Washington, D.C. I had managed to book 3 seats on the last flight out of LAX, and we spent the journey in relative silence, each of us processing the dramatic shift in our family's circumstances. Daniel met us at Dulles Airport with a security detail that made my parents' eyes widen. 2 black SUVs, men in dark suits speaking into earpieces, a coordinated operation just to pick up his fiancée and her parents from the airport. Mr. and Mrs. Martinez, Daniel said as we approached, extending his hand to my father. I owe you both a significant apology for not being more forthcoming about my work. My father shook his hand, studying Daniel's face carefully. Son, I think we're the ones who owe you an apology. Not at all, sir. You were looking out for your daughter's best interests. I respect that. As we drove through the Virginia countryside toward downtown Washington, Daniel explained what would happen at the confirmation hearing. The Senate Armed Services Committee would question him about his qualifications, his policy positions, and his vision for the Department of Defense. The process could take several hours, and the outcome, while likely positive, wasn't guaranteed. What happens if they don't confirm you? I asked. Then I go back to my previous position and we plan a quiet wedding in Sacramento, he replied, squeezing my hand. And if they do confirm you? Then everything changes. We stayed that night at a hotel near Capitol Hill. I couldn't sleep, alternating between excitement and terror about what the morning would bring. When I finally dozed off around 3 a.m., I dreamed about wedding ceremonies with metal detectors and Secret Service agents walking me down the aisle. The next morning, as we walked up the steps of the Hart Senate office building, photographers snapped pictures and reporters shouted questions. My mother gripped my arm tightly, overwhelmed by the chaos and attention. Is this what it's always going to be like? She whispered. I have no idea, I whispered back. We were escorted to a viewing area where family members could watch the proceedings. Daniel looked calm and confident at the witness table, answering questions about military readiness, defense spending, and international security threats with the kind of expertise that made it clear why he'd been chosen for this position. Senator Patricia Walsh from Oregon leaned forward during her questioning period. Mr. Thompson, some of your colleagues have mentioned that you're engaged to be married. How do you plan to balance the demands of this position with your personal life? Daniel glanced briefly in our direction before answering. Senator, I'm engaged to a remarkable woman who works tirelessly to help veterans access the healthcare benefits they've earned. She understands service and sacrifice, and she supports my commitment to this role. I believe that having a strong personal foundation actually enhances one's ability to serve effectively in demanding positions. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand. 4 hours later, the committee voted 18-4 to confirm Daniel Thompson as the 29th Secretary of Defense. The celebration dinner that evening was surreal. We sat in a private dining room at the Willard Hotel, just blocks from the White House, while Daniel fielded congratulatory calls from senators, foreign ministers, and military commanders from around the world. Each time his phone rang, he would apologize and step away from the table, leaving my parents and me to marvel at our new reality. "I still can't believe this is happening," my mother said, watching Daniel through the glass partition as he spoke animatedly with someone about NATO operations in Eastern Europe. My father was studying the wine menu with an expression of disbelief. "Sophia, do you see these prices? A single bottle costs more than I used to spend on groceries for a week." "Dad, you don't have to worry about money anymore." "That's just it, I don't know how to not worry about money. Your mother and I have been budgeting and saving and watching every penny for 30 years. Now our daughter is engaged to someone who probably makes more in a month than we made in a year." Daniel returned to the table, slipping his phone into his jacket pocket. "Sorry about that. The Joint Chiefs wanted to discuss the transition timeline." "The Joint Chiefs," my mother repeated faintly. "As in, the people who run all the different branches of the military?" "Yes, ma'am. They report directly to me now." The weight of his new responsibilities was becoming clearer by the hour. Over dinner, Daniel explained that he would be sworn in the following week, after which he would move into the secretary's residence at Fort McNair. He would have a staff of thousands, a budget of over $700 billion, and the responsibility for overseeing America's entire defense apparatus. "What about our wedding?" I asked during dessert. "That depends on what you want," Daniel replied carefully. "We can still have the small ceremony we planned, but it will require significant security measures. Or we can have something larger, more formal, befitting the position. The choice is entirely yours." My father cleared his throat. "Son, if you don't mind me asking, what would you prefer?" Daniel looked at me, then at my parents. "I'd prefer to marry Sophia surrounded by the people who love her most. Everything else is just logistics." 3 weeks later, our backyard wedding had transformed into something none of us could have imagined. The guest list had grown from 30 people to over 200, including senators, cabinet members, foreign ambassadors, and military officials. The Secret Service had converted my parents' modest riverside home into a secured compound, complete with metal detectors, bomb-sniffing dogs, and snipers positioned on neighboring rooftops. My mother spent the morning of the wedding in a state of controlled panic, directing caterers who had been cleared by federal background checks and florists who had submitted detailed inventories of every flower and decoration. "I can't believe we're hosting senators in our backyard," she whispered to me as I got ready in my childhood bedroom. "I can't believe I'm marrying the Secretary of Defense in the same room where I used to play with Barbies." My wedding dress, purchased months earlier at a modest bridal shop in Sacramento, suddenly felt inadequate for the occasion. But when Daniel saw me walking down the aisle that my father had created between rows of folding chairs borrowed from the church, his expression told me that I could have been wearing a paper bag and he would have thought I was the most beautiful woman in the world. The ceremony itself was surprisingly intimate despite the circumstances. Father Rodriguez, who had baptized me as a baby, performed the service with the same warmth and humor he brought to every family celebration. When Daniel and I exchanged vows, promising to support each other through whatever challenges lay ahead, I felt like we were the only two people in the world. The reception, however, was unlike anything Riverside had ever seen. A 4-star general gave a toast about Daniel's military service and leadership qualities. The French ambassador complimented my mother's tamales in heavily accented English. 2 senators from opposite parties found themselves agreeing about something for the first time in years while sharing a table near the dessert station. "Mrs. Thompson," Senator Walsh approached me during the dancing, "I wanted to tell you how impressed I was with your fiancé, your husband, during his confirmation hearing. You should be very proud." "Thank you, Senator. And please, call me Sophia." "Sophia, then. I hope you know that the role of a cabinet member's spouse is significant in its own right. You'll have opportunities to advocate for causes you care about, to represent American values on the international stage. Have you given thought to how you want to use this platform?" I hadn't, actually. The past month had been such a whirlwind that I'd barely had time to process the personal changes, let alone consider my public responsibilities. "I'd like to continue working with veterans and their families," I said. "That's been my passion for years." "Excellent. There are several initiatives at the Department of Veterans Affairs that could benefit from your advocacy. I'll have my staff send you some information." As the evening wound down and the last of the guests departed, my parents and I sat on their back patio, exhausted but exhilarated. Daniel was inside, taking a conference call with military commanders in Afghanistan about an urgent security situation. "Do you think you'll miss your old life?" my father asked, watching Daniel through the sliding glass door as he paced while speaking into his phone. "Parts of it," I admitted. I'll miss the simplicity, the privacy, the ability to make decisions without considering national security implications. But I've never been prouder to stand beside someone. Dad, you should have seen him during those confirmation hearings. The knowledge he has, the respect he commands, the way he thinks about protecting our country, it's incredible. My mother smiled. You know, when you first brought Daniel home, I was so worried that you were settling for less than you deserved. Now I'm wondering if he might be settling for less than he deserves. Mom. I'm serious, Mija. The Secretary of Defense could marry anyone, senators' daughters, ambassadors' daughters, women with advanced degrees and political connections and social standing. Instead, he chose a girl from Riverside who works at a nonprofit and drives a Honda Civic. Hey, I have a college degree. You know what I mean. He chose you because of who you are, not because of what you could do for his career. That's real love. Daniel finally finished his call and joined us on the patio, loosening his tie and sitting down beside me with a heavy sigh. Everything okay? I asked. Just routine check-ins from various time zones. Nothing that can't wait until tomorrow. Tomorrow's Sunday, my father pointed out. National security doesn't take weekends off, Mr. Martinez. Please, call me Roberto. We're family now. Daniel smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression I'd seen on his face all day. Thank you, Roberto. That means more to me than you know. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the cleanup crew dismantling the reception area and the distant hum of the security perimeter that would remain in place until morning. Any regrets? Daniel asked me quietly. About marrying you? Never. About the circus that your life is about to become? I considered the question seriously. In 6 months, I had gone from being an unknown nonprofit worker to the wife of one of the most powerful people in America. My photograph would appear in newspapers and magazines. My clothing choices would be analyzed by fashion bloggers. My every public appearance would be scrutinized for political implications, but I had also married a man who put duty and service above personal ambition, who treated my parents with respect and kindness, who remembered to ask about my work even when he was managing global military operations. A man who had chosen love over convenience at every turn. Ask me again in a year, I said, taking his hand. But I think we're going to be just fine. 6 months later, I was proven right. Daniel excelled in his role, earning bipartisan praise for his leadership and strategic vision. I found my own path as an advocate for military families, working closely with the Department of Veterans Affairs on initiatives to improve healthcare access and educational opportunities. My parents became regular visitors to Washington, with my father serving as an unofficial advisor on law enforcement issues and my mother becoming surprisingly adept at hosting political dinner parties, and sometimes, late at night in our quarters at Fort McNair, Daniel and I would laugh about how we started as two people colliding over spilled coffee and ended up as one of the most closely watched couples in American politics. The best part was that despite everything that had changed, the man I fell asleep next to every night was still the same person who had helped me gather scattered papers from a coffee shop floor and offered to pay for my dry cleaning. Some love stories end with happily ever after. Ours ended with classified, but happy. 2 years into Daniel's tenure as Secretary of Defense, I thought I had adapted to our extraordinary life. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday morning in March when everything changed again. I was in my office at the Department of Veterans Affairs, reviewing proposals for a new mental health initiative, when my assistant knocked on my door with an unusual expression. Mrs. Thompson, there's a call for you from the White House Chief of Staff. The Chief of Staff didn't call the spouse of a cabinet member unless something significant was happening. My first thought was that Daniel had been injured or that there was some kind of security threat. Sophia, Margaret Chen's voice was crisp and professional when I picked up the phone. I need you to come to the White House immediately. Can you be here in 20 minutes? Is Daniel okay? The secretary is fine. This is about something else entirely. How quickly can you get here? 15 minutes later, I was walking through the West Wing, escorted by an aide I didn't recognize toward the Oval Office. The president was waiting for me, along with Margaret and 2 other senior advisors I'd met at various state functions. Sophia, thank you for coming so quickly, President Harrison said, gesturing for me to sit in one of the chairs facing his desk. I need to discuss something with you that's going to sound completely insane. I had learned that when the President of the United States tells you something is going to sound insane, you should prepare yourself for anything. 3 hours ago, the President continued, Ambassador Patricia Kellerman submitted her resignation as our envoy to the United Nations. Her mother has been diagnosed with late-stage cancer, and she needs to return to Oregon immediately to provide care. I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. President. The thing is, we need a replacement quickly. There are several critical votes coming. Up in the Security Council, and we can't afford to have an acting ambassador who doesn't have the full confidence of the international community. I nodded, wondering why this required my immediate presence in the Oval Office. Sophia, Margaret said, leaning forward, we want to nominate you as ambassador to the United Nations. I stared at her, certain I had misheard. I'm sorry, what? You have a master's degree in international relations from Georgetown, the president said, consulting a folder on his desk. You've spent the last 2 years working closely with our allies on Veterans Affairs initiatives. You've attended G7 summits, NATO meetings, and bilateral negotiations. The international community knows and respects you. But I'm not a diplomat. I work on domestic veterans issues. You are a diplomat, Margaret corrected. You just haven't had the official title. Do you remember the meeting with the German Minister of Defense last month, when there was a disagreement about military base funding? I did remember. There had been a tense moment when the minister had taken offense at something Daniel had said about burden sharing, and I had stepped in to clarify the American position while acknowledging the German perspective. You defused that situation better than most career diplomats could have, the president said. And the French ambassador specifically requested that you be included in next month's discussions about NATO expansion because, and I quote, Mrs. Thompson understands both the military and political implications of these decisions. Mr. President, I'm flattered, but there's more, he interrupted. Your work with veterans has given you credibility on humanitarian issues. Your marriage to the Secretary of Defense means you understand security concerns better than most civilians. And frankly, your background as someone who wasn't born into politics or wealth resonates with people around the world. I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. 2 years ago, my biggest professional challenge had been writing grant proposals for a small nonprofit. Now the president was asking me to represent the United States at the most important international forum in the world. What does Daniel think about this? We haven't told him yet, Margaret admitted. We wanted to talk to you first, to see if you'd be interested before we started the official process. This would mean moving to New York, wouldn't it? Yes, though you'd maintain your security clearance and work closely with the Secretary of Defense on matters involving both departments. It's actually not uncommon for spouses of senior officials to serve in diplomatic roles. The president stood up and walked around his desk to sit in the chair next to mine. Sophia, I'm going to be direct with you. The world is changing rapidly. And we need people at the UN who can build bridges while standing firm on American principles. You've proven you can do both. Can I think about it? Of course. But I need an answer by tomorrow morning. If you say yes, we'll announce your nomination tomorrow afternoon, and confirmation hearings will begin next week. Next week? The timeline felt impossibly fast. International crises don't wait for convenient scheduling, Margaret said. And we need someone in place before the Security Council vote on the Middle East resolution. I left the White House in a daze, my mind spinning with the implications of what had just been offered to me. When I arrived home at Fort McNair that evening, Daniel was in his study, reviewing intelligence briefings with 2 of his senior aides. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway, immediately noticing my expression. Gentlemen, we'll continue this tomorrow morning. After his aides left, Daniel poured 2 glasses of wine and joined me on the couch in our living room. Rough day? The president wants to nominate me as ambassador to the United Nations. Daniel set down his wine glass without taking a sip. What? I explained the entire conversation, watching Daniel's expression shift from surprise to concern to something that looked like pride. What did you tell him? He asked when I finished. That I needed to think about it. And that I needed to talk to you. Sophia, this is an incredible opportunity. Do you want to do it? I don't know. Part of me is terrified, and part of me is excited. But I'm also worried about us. We've finally found a rhythm that works, and this would change everything. Again. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, considering. You know, when I was nominated for this position, I was terrified too. I kept thinking about all the ways I might fail, all the responsibilities I wasn't sure I was ready for. And then I realized that the fact that I was scared probably meant I understood the magnitude of the job. People who aren't scared of these kinds of responsibilities are usually the ones who shouldn't have them. So you think I should do it? I think you should do whatever feels right to you. But if you're asking for my opinion, I think you'd be an extraordinary ambassador. That night, I called my parents to tell them about the offer. My mother's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. Mija, do you understand what this means? Our daughter, representing America at the United Nations. My father was more cautious. Are you sure you're ready for this kind of responsibility, Sophia? This isn't just about veterans affairs anymore. This is about wars and peace, international law, global security. I know, Dad. That's what scares me. Good, he said, surprising me. If you weren't scared, I'd be worried about your judgment. The next morning, I called the White House and accepted the nomination. The confirmation process was intense but straightforward. During my hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I was questioned about everything from my views on nuclear nonproliferation to my strategy for addressing climate change in international forums. Senator Bradley from Texas leaned back in his chair during his questioning period. Mrs. Thompson, some people might say that you're only being nominated because of your husband's position. How do you respond to that? Senator, I understand that perception, and I've thought about it seriously. My husband's role certainly gave me exposure to international affairs that I wouldn't have had otherwise. But exposure isn't the same as qualification. I believe my master's degree in international relations, my 2 years of direct experience working with foreign officials, and my demonstrated ability to build consensus on complex issues make me qualified for this position. My marriage to the Secretary of Defense is a fact, but it's not my only credential. The committee voted 16-2 to confirm my nomination. 3 weeks later, I was sworn in as the United States Ambassador to the United Nations in a ceremony at the State Department. Daniel stood beside me as I took the oath, and I could see the pride in his eyes as I promised to defend and represent American interests on the global stage. My parents sat in the front row, my mother crying openly and my father looking like he still couldn't quite believe his daughter was about to become one of America's top diplomats. After the ceremony, as we walked out of the State Department building, Daniel took my hand. Any regrets? He asked, echoing the question he'd posed on our wedding night. Ask me again after my first Security Council meeting, I replied, but as we drove through the streets of Washington toward our farewell dinner with friends and colleagues, I felt something I hadn't expected: readiness. For the first time since this whole journey began, I wasn't just adapting to circumstances or rising to meet expectations placed on me by others. I was choosing to step into a role I believed I could fill, representing a country I loved, working alongside a man who supported my ambitions as much as I supported his. It had taken me 2 years to realize that being the wife of the Secretary of Defense wasn't a limitation on my own potential, it was a foundation I could build upon to create something uniquely my own. As Daniel liked to say, some challenges are too important to leave to other people. I was about to find out if international diplomacy was one of them. 6 months into my tenure as UN ambassador, I faced the biggest crisis of my diplomatic career. It was also the moment that would define not just my professional future, but the future of my marriage to Daniel. The call came at 3 a.m. on a Thursday in September. I was in my apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan when my secure phone buzzed with an emergency alert. The Situation Room at the UN building was already bustling with activity when I arrived 30 minutes later, still in jeans and a hastily thrown on blazer. Ambassador, my Deputy Chief of Staff briefed me as we walked through the corridors, we have a developing situation in the South China Sea. A Chinese naval vessel collided with a Philippine fishing boat 6 hours ago. The Philippines is claiming it was intentional. China is saying it was an accident. Both sides are mobilizing military assets. This was exactly the kind of crisis that could spiral into international conflict within hours. As we entered the emergency session of the Security Council, I could see the tension in every diplomat's face. The Chinese ambassador was speaking in hushed but animated tones with his aide. The Philippine representative looked furious. The Russian ambassador was taking notes with the expression of someone who saw opportunity in chaos. The United States calls for immediate de-escalation. I began when it was my turn to address the Council. We propose sending an independent investigation team to determine the facts while all parties agree to withdraw military assets to their previous positions. The Chinese ambassador shook his head before I finished speaking. The United States has no standing to mediate this dispute. Your military alliance with the Philippines compromises your neutrality. That's when things got complicated. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel, POTUS authorizing military escort for investigation team. Be ready. I stared at the message, my heart sinking. Military escort meant American naval vessels would be entering disputed waters. It meant the situation was about to escalate dramatically. And it meant I was about to be caught between my duty as a UN ambassador to promote peaceful resolution and my husband's responsibility as Secretary of Defense to protect American interests. The next 12 hours tested everything I had learned about diplomacy, marriage, and myself. I spent the morning in back-to-back meetings with individual ambassadors, trying to build consensus for a peaceful solution. The French were supportive but cautious. The British wanted stronger language condemning China. The African Union representatives were focused on establishing precedent for territorial disputes. Everyone had an angle, and everyone was watching to see how the newest ambassador would handle her first major crisis. At noon, I received a call from Daniel. Sophia, I need you to know that naval assets are moving toward the area. The president wants to show support for our Philippine allies. Daniel, I'm trying to negotiate a peaceful resolution here. Military movements are going to make that impossible. I understand your position, but I have my orders. There was a long pause on the line. For the first time since our wedding, our professional responsibilities were directly conflicting. How much time do I have? I asked. 18 hours before our ships reach the area. Give me 24. Sophia, 24 hours, Daniel. If I can't broker a solution by then, you do what you have to do. Another pause. I'll see what I can do. That afternoon, I did something unprecedented. I called for a closed-door session with just the American, Chinese, and Philippine ambassadors. No staff, no press, no official record. Gentlemen, I said. As we sat around a small conference table, we're about to watch a fishing boat accident turn into an international incident that could cost lives on all sides. I'm proposing we find a face-saving solution for everyone before that happens. The Chinese ambassador, Liu Wei, was a veteran diplomat who had been skeptical of my appointment from the beginning. Ambassador Thompson, with respect, what can you offer that addresses China's concerns about American interference in regional affairs? What if the investigation team is led by ASEAN nations, not the US? What if we agree that whatever the investigation finds, the response will be economic rather than military? The Philippine ambassador, Carlos Mendoza, leaned forward. And what guarantee do we have that China will accept the findings? The same guarantee China has that the Philippines will, I replied. We make the consequences of rejecting the findings more costly than accepting them. What followed was 8 hours of the most intense negotiations of my life. We ordered dinner and worked through the evening, crafting language that would allow China to acknowledge an accident without admitting intentional aggression, permit the Philippines to claim vindication without demanding military action, and enable the United States to support its ally without deploying naval forces. At 2 a.m., we had a framework agreement. By 6 a.m., we had full text approved by all three governments. By 8 a.m., the Security Council had voted unanimously to endorse the peaceful resolution. When I finally returned to my apartment that evening, exhausted but elated, I found Daniel waiting for me with takeout from my favorite Italian restaurant and a bottle of champagne. I heard about the resolution, he said, kissing me as I walked through the door. The president called it masterful diplomacy. And the naval deployment? Cancelled 2 hours ago. I collapsed onto the couch beside him, suddenly feeling the weight of the past 36 hours. Daniel, what happens the next time our jobs conflict like this? He was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. I think we figure it out the same way we figured it out today. We trust each other to do our jobs well, and we communicate about what we need. Even if it means disagreeing professionally. Especially. Then, Sophia, watching you work these past few months has been incredible. You're not just representing America at the UN, you're representing the best of what America can be. I would never want my job to limit what you can accomplish in yours. 6 months later, when the president offered to nominate me as Secretary of State to replace the retiring Harrison Matthews, Daniel was the first person to encourage me to accept. But that would mean we'd both be in the cabinet, I protested. We'd both be in the line of succession. Doesn't that create some kind of constitutional issue? Maybe, Daniel grinned. But it also means we'd be the most powerful couple in Washington. Are you sure you're ready for that? Are you kidding? I've been married to you for 3 years now. I've watched you go from a non-profit worker to UN ambassador to potential Secretary of State. At this point, I'm pretty sure you could run for president and win. Don't give me any ideas. As I write this, I'm preparing for my confirmation hearings to become Secretary of State. My parents are flying in from California, where my father now serves as a consultant on police reform initiatives, and my mother has become an unexpected expert on diplomatic protocol. Sometimes I think about that first dinner at my parents' house, when they worried that Daniel couldn't provide for a family. Now we're both cabinet members, we own homes in Washington and California, and my mother regularly hosts foreign ambassadors for informal dinners where she serves her famous tamales, but the thing that hasn't changed is what Daniel said on our wedding night. At the end of the day, we're still the same two people who met in a coffee shop and fell in love over spilled caffeine. The difference is that now, when we disagree about foreign policy over breakfast, it actually matters for international relations. Daniel likes to joke that we went from being nobody special to being two of the most watched people in America. I prefer to think that we were always special. We just found a way to be special on a bigger stage. The best part is that my parents finally stopped worrying about whether Daniel was good enough for me. Now they worry about whether America is good enough for both of us. Some love stories are about finding your soulmate. Ours turned out to be about finding your soulmate and then conquering Washington together, and yes, we still drive that old Honda Accord on weekends, just to remember where we came from. After all, some things are too important to change, even when everything else in your life gets turned upside down. My mother was right about one thing, though. I did marry someone who could provide for a family, she just had no idea he'd also help me provide for an entire country. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.